Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of the medieval apothecary's midnight secret. Come closer to the small glow of a single lamp. Let the world outside soften to a hush. The market stalls folded like sleeping birds, the city gates drawn shut beneath a heaven of dimmed stars. Imagine a narrow street of cobbles, still warm from the day and now listening to the quiet footsteps of night. Breathe in the calm, for we are about to drift into a gentler time, an hour when the bells have finished their count and the wind threads a silver ribbon through empty alleys. Inside a shop where herbs hang like small green constellations, an apothecary waits at a wooden counter, mortar and pestle, poised like the moon cupped in the hands of earth. But listen, there is something more than rest in this hour. There is a question the darkness keeps on its tongue, a promise folded into the crease of midnight. On a shelf by the lattice window lies a sealed vial, pale as dawn milk, marked not with chalk or ink, but with a notch carved by a patient knife, one stroke for each night the apothecary has waited. Tonight, the notches will end. Tonight, a secret will lift its face like a flower that only blooms in moonlight. Now slow your breathing. Let your shoulders ease. Let the day fall away. We will walk softly through this story, unafraid, unhurried, as if crossing a bridge woven of sleep. And yet the bell has just finished its 12th whisper, and somewhere a cloaked figure pauses at a door that has never been locked, though it is always closed. A secret helps the latch to rise. Footsteps pass over the threshold like a turning page. Chapter 1. The scent of rue and rain. The shop, by day, was a wreath of colour and murmur. Children leaned on the sill to smell lavender. Bakers came with flour, still dusting their sleeves, to ask for comfrey when they lifted too many sacks. Sailors, when the river ran swollen from spring melt, bought sage to keep their courage dry. By night, however, everything leaned inward, bowls, bundles, and jars, listening to the breath of their keeper. Her name was Matilde. Some called her Master Matilde, though she smiled at the title, for she kept none in her service besides a quiet cat and a small brass bell to call herself back from thoughts. Her hair had the colour of chestnuts kept through winter, and her eyes, under their steady lids, carried a river's patience. In the city rolls she was listed apothecary, licensed by the guild, and taxed like any other merchant. In the city's whispers she was more than that. Watcher of fevers, binder of wounds, keeper of a ledger written with an ink so pale it seemed like evaporated breath. The night had rained just enough to make the world smell of whetstone and rosemary. Every roof tile held a single drop like a small held word. Matilde had opened the shutters to draw in the tender air and sat by the window where she could see the street. On the sill, a little clay saucer cooled a pinch of rue and mint she had bruised, the leaves glistening under a film of dew. She worked with a care so deliberate that even a moth would have slowed to watch. Pestles circling, hand steady, breath matched to the turning. The old herbal from St. Bennet lay open under her palm, its vellum pages slightly translucent and warm to the touch. She had annotated it in the margins with her neat hand gentle amendments to sainted advice. For who, after all, could argue with the patient evidence of years and the quiet conversation of plants? The secret waited in the back room. A narrow door marked by a simple X would have meant nothing to a stranger, but to Matilde it was a boundary, both oath and comfort. Behind it stood a table where the hoard of midnight was kept, dew gathered from the ramparts at moonrise, beeswax melted in a bowl with a whisper of crushed hyssop, a coil of clean linen, a single page torn from a much older book and kept between two slivers of wood. She had not read the page, not truly. She had traced the ink with her eyes, the way one follows a path with fingertips. But reading would be to like owning, and some knowledge, like fireflies, must be invited and not caught. Her cat padded in with the secret quiet of cats, and lifted its face, the tip of its nose like a seed of pepper, to the scent of rue. It blinked once, and settled nearby, arranging its tail as if considering a line of poetry. Matilde struck the lamp a little brighter. The flame opened like a flower. In its light, the copper scales hung from their hook as if weighing shadows. Jars bore labels in Latin and French, and, in one or two cases, in the old tongue her father had taught her when she was a girl, who sat on the floor threading chamomile heads onto twine and listening to him describe the way riverbanks keep their own library. Willow for grief, meadow sweet for pain, elder for fever, mint for troubled winds of the belly. He had been more cautious than tender, or perhaps his tenderness had always been quiet. He taught caution as if it were a prayer measured twice. Heat once. Never seal a glass while it still breathes. Keep your thumb on the weight as the scale settles. And never, never measure while angry. When the 12th bell finished, the sound folded back into the tower, leaving something like velvet in the street. Matilde heard it like a cue. She rose, her body remembering familiar turns. Lift the latch on the back room door. Fetch the small clasped chest. Carry it to the counter. Her fingers brushed the little notch-carved vial, and the cool glass answered her skin. The vial had waited through 3 lunar cycles. Not that time itself made medicines, but there were powers in patience. Every evening's dew a drop added to a bowl left on the sill. Every dawn's breath a brief blessing over the coils of linen. Every night the same prayer unvoiced in her mind to harm none, to heal what would be healed, to be honest about sorrow. They had asked her to keep this secret a season ago, in the late winter when roofs wore white caps and the river moved like a sleeping creature turned on its side. The asking had not been formal, no writ or seal, merely a girl no more than 13, with boots too large and cheeks scalded by cold, had come at dusk and placed on the counter a small token, a brass ring with the city crest softened by touch. She had not named its owner. She had not said my father, though Matilde heard the word pressed between the girl's breaths. He is bound, the girl said, by his own fear. But his fear is older than my grandfather. He wakes each night and cannot cross the shallowest darkness without calling for a candle. He cannot bear a closed door. He cannot abide a silence. The girl swallowed, and Matilde, while listening, had noticed how she tried to keep her hands still, as if courage were something one could hold like water. He rules, the girl said in a lower voice, although the shop was empty, and a man who rules cannot ask for a child's cure. She didn't say what rules meant: magistrate, councilman, guildmaster, but Matilde heard enough. Will you make, the girl asked, a medicine that teaches Night to be gentle with him? Matilde had stood for a while looking at the ring. Some commissions arrived with a dogma for a backbone: make me a purge, make me a draught to keep from sleep, make me a hope against childbed fever. This one had arrived wrapped not in certainty but in love. Make me a quiet, for a man who forgot what quiet feels like. It asked for more than sleep. It asked for trust between Night and a man who did not trust it. Matilde had nodded and returned the ring, and the girl had disappeared as silently as a hand leaves a basin of water. Since then dew, beeswax, a tear of cherry resin, powdered pearl ground until it no longer shone, a breath of fennel for courage, a breath of linden for softness. She had not made a soporific that would drown a man's thoughts. She had not made an enchantment. She did not deal in the kind of courage that came from forgetting. She had made something more fragile, and, perhaps, more stubborn. A tincture to enlarge the threshold, to make the first step into darkness feel like walking from one room to another in one's own house. Tonight, as the seasons allowed, the tincture would be ready. The street gave a distant yawn, the kind that happens when a watchman too long awake looks up and cannot find the moon. Matilde felt the night's temper pitch toward stillness. In that breathless pocket, the cat pricked its ears. Softly, so softly, the latch lifted. No knock. Not out of rudeness, but out of the nature of secrets, which prefer not to knock. The door opened as a field opens to fog. A figure stood framed by the darkness beyond, neither tall nor short, wrapped in a cloak not unlike the ones merchants wore for travel. With the hem darkened where it had brushed wet stones, the hood, drawn low, made a small cave of the visitor's face. Matilde felt not fear, but the way a violin string feels a nearby tune, a sympathetic readiness to answer. "Good evening," she said, although it was, strictly speaking, after such things, this is a house that keeps its evenings long. The figure exhaled, the sigh folded into cloth. "You are Master Matilde." "I am Matilde," she said, "and I do my work with the care the city allows me." A hand gloved in thin leather reached into the cloak and placed upon the counter the brass ring with the softened crest. Matilde did not look at it as if it were a flag or a ransom. She looked at it as if it were a book opened to a familiar page. "I remember," she said. The figure paused. From beneath the hood came a voice, neither high nor low, constructed the way people speak when the words are heavier than they can carry. He cannot breathe in a room with extinguished candles. He cannot walk a corridor without a torch. He cannot bear a church at night unless the moon sits directly in the western window. He has told no one. He thinks people do not notice that he orders meetings for dawn, that he speaks near braziers, that his sentences bend at the mention of night. But I have watched him from winters into springs, and I have learned the shape of his silence. We cannot hold our city through summers to come, if he must never close. His eyes without a second fire lit in the corner. The hand lifted from the counter. "Is it ready?" "It is ready," Matilde said, her voice a warm cloth laid over a bowl. "But the medicine is not a promise of sudden things. It is a teacher, not a chain. It will ask him to step, and then to step again, not because there is danger or virtue in stepping, but because the night did not build itself to frighten him." She did not say more. It was not her way to annotate a cure with sermons. She reached for the notch-marked vial. In the lamp's light, it seemed to have its own small heart. The gloved hand did not move to take it. Instead, the figure lifted the hood a little. It was the girl, now older by a season, yet the winter's honesty remained in her eyes. She looked at the vial as if a small boat had been placed into her palms. "What must he do?" she asked. "He must taste," Matilde said, "not drink. 1 drop an hour before the bells count for sleep. 1 drop on the tongue and 1 drop on the wrists, as if you were teaching a pulse to listen. He must leave a door ajar, not a gate, not a posture of invitation to fear, but a door he knows well, his dressing chamber, perhaps. He must set 1 candle aside and ask himself whether the other 2 will suffice. He must tell the darkness, if he can, 1 thing he remembers that is beautiful, not to convince it to be kind, but to remind himself he has always carried a night, even at noon, and that the night inside him has never hurt him." She paused, then added, 3 nights thus. On the 4th, 2 drops, and the candle left unlit. On the 7th, he should walk the corridor between his room and the garden. While the moon is thin and new, he should not force his breath. The tincture will not fight his fear, it will walk beside it. And if he refuses? The girl asked with none of the drama one might expect of her age. She asked it like somebody counting sacks of grain. If he cannot leave the candle, then he should set the candle a step farther, Matilde said gently. The body keeps old ledgers more faithfully than we know. It can be slow to begin a new page. He must not shame himself for what his body learned when it was frightened. And if he is angry at fear, let it be a small anger that he holds and then releases, like a sparrow who panicked in a room and now finds the open window. The girl's mouth softened in a way that had nothing to do with a cure and everything to do with hearing that tenderness could be a discipline. She lifted the vial. It weighed almost nothing, and yet it changed the shape of her hand, as if she had been given the first letter of a new alphabet. You ask no name, she observed. I ask nothing that would make your steps heavier, Matilde replied. But I will give you something that might make them lighter. She reached under the counter and brought forth a small square of linen folded around something thin. She unwrapped it to reveal a sprig dried and careful of linden flowers, their papery bracts pale like small sails. Hang this where he rests, she said, where a draught might lift it now and then. The linden is the tree that gathers villagers under it when there is news. Let it gather his breaths. The girl nodded, and the cat, as if approving, flexed its paws as though needing time. You will be paid, the girl began, formality returning to shore up the edges of her voice. You have paid, Matilde said, and touched the counter where the ring had been. Return what is yours. Let the city keep its honor in your house. If there must be coin, let it be copper and small, in a pouch left on the step after he sleeps. That will be payment enough. I am sure your house knows where to find a step. The faintest smile tipped the corner of her mouth. The girl's hand hesitated over the ring, then closed around it. The hood fell forward. She looked younger again, but steadier. Is there any danger? She asked in the voice of a daughter who has learned too early how to ask like a steward. Only of a kind we should not fear, Matilde said. The danger of noticing that we are kinder to others than we are to ourselves. The danger of seeing that our breath is a choir, not a single voice. If he feels his heart fasten itself like a shutter in wind, remind him that shutters exist so we can sleep without fearing weather. The girl tucked the vial into her cloak as one might tuck a letter near the heart. She bowed her head, not ceremonially, but in gratitude that left the air slightly warmed. She turned to go and then paused, listening, as Matilde was listening, to some sound layered into the night, the iron-shod step of a watchman, the soft laugh of a pair of late-working bakers, the click of the cat's tongue as it dreamed. Will he be ashamed? She asked, not moving. Matilde's answer was immediate, and it was the kind that lands gently and stays. Not if you are not, she said, and not if those who love him remember that fear is only a night rehearsing the coming day. The door closed with a hush. The shop drew a long, slow breath, as if its own ribs widened and settled. Matilde returned to the back room and stood for a time without lamp, letting the shape of darkness become familiar again. She had learned, in a life spent near oils and powders, that some tinctures let their work vanish as soon as the cure was dropped on the tongue. Some leave their work where eyes can see like salves that calm a burn to pearl-coloured skin, and some rare and quiet work on both the ailment and the story that grew around it. Those were the medicines she most respected, and they were the ones that asked the least spectacle in return. She lit the lamp by the door, blew it softly to dimness, and counted her vials, her thumb sliding along glass like a reader moving through a familiar line of script. paused when memory paused. The vial that had been there for a poor woman who could not carry any more grief in her hands. The jar of crushed rose hips for the boy who believed his stammer was a curse, when it was only the way his heart ran ahead of his tongue. The satchel of caraway seeds for the teacher who wore loneliness like a heavy scarf and wanted to learn how to breathe differently. She remembered their faces the way one remembers the faces of statues, gently, because stone is always listening. There was, however, a second secret in her shop tonight, and it had little to do with tinctures. She had not yet named it to herself. It hovered at the corner of her tasks like a bird prepared to land. She felt it more than thought it. The sense that the city itself had approached the outer edge of something. The war in the south had ended months ago with contracts and ceremonials. Yet trade wagons still arrived with straw in their wheels and stories in their axles. And among these stories were silences that said more than the words. That men who had known fire at night found peace almost a stranger. That widows had learned the names of the hours and now did not know how to forget them. That boys taken for soldiers had learned the taste of fear and returned with the taste still on their tongues. The city, although cobbled and lawful and devout, needed a medicine like the one she had just given, a way to walk into darkness without carrying old flames. She stepped back into the front room and closed the shutter that faced the street. Not fully just enough to make the lamp feel like a hearth. The cat, seeing her hand move, rose and wound itself around her ankles, a little loop of living warmth. Matilde stroked its spine and felt a question kindle under her skin. To whom does the apothecary turn when her heart begins to lean under the weight of other hearts to begin to answer? She wrote. Her ledger was not an account book, though there was one of those, too, where she wrote sums and prices with the spare penmanship of someone who liked order without worshipping it. The ledger she opened now was bound in rough willow-grey leather that had softened under years of hands. The pages smelled faintly of sheep and rain. She dipped the nib and began a new entry in the pale ink meant to be more private than hidden. Midnight, early spring. Commission completed for a house I will not name. Tincture for fear of unlit rooms. Made as a teacher, not a blindfold. Remind, fear is an hour, not a cathedral. She paused, the nib hovering, the cat's purr adding a murmur to the room's softness. Then she wrote what the night had placed in her and what perhaps she should have said to the girl but knew was not yet for the girl's ears. Fear has rituals the body thinks are prayers. The cure must be a new ritual offered gently, not as a condemnation, but as a different way to kneel. She set down the pen. The room watched. Outside, the rain had finished its telling. Water drew itself quietly into gutters. Eaves let go their last drops, which hit the street like small feet. A wind moved through a space among the buildings and rearranged the scent in the shop, now hyssop, now rue, now a whisper of nutmeg from a merchant's jar meant for kitchens rather than cures. She thought of the spice road, the long path of sand and wind, and the page of the sea upon which sailors wrote with ropes and salt. Her father used to say that each jar of cinnamon brought the sound of a different port with it. That if you listened while you lifted the lid, you would hear masts talking to one another, sails speaking in their rustle. Matilde had never sailed. Her voyages were measured in steps to the riverbank and back, and yet she knew motion by the leaves in her window, the way they turned their faces toward whatever wind was kind. She knew there would be another knock, another ring, another story brought in a gloved hand or hidden in a child's voice. She knew that some nights would ask for sage and clean water, and some for the sort of courage that could not be decanted. She knew that, in the end, The most faithful medicines were not substances, but gestures repeated until the heart believed them. The laying down of a weight, the patient polishing of a thought. The way a door left a finger width open tells the night, "You are not my enemy. I am not yours." She banked the lamp again and took up a spoon. From a jar painted with a blue hair, she scooped a measure of honey into a small bowl and stirred in a strand of saffron. The golden color rose like early morning pooling in a spoon. This was for an old woman who had lost her appetite after a winter illness and who needed to be reminded that sweetness still lived in the world. She would take it in small sips, as if receiving a letter from a friend. Matilde wrapped the bowl in cloth and set it near the door, so she would not forget to carry it in the morning when she visited the woman's home. There were still chores, wick trimming, jotting down what must be bought when the market opened linen thread, a new stopper for the vinegar jar, chamomile if the price was fair. She moved among these tasks with the unthinking grace of those who can handle a kettle and a quill in the same hour. When she finished, she washed her hands with water scented with lemon balm and looked into the glass, the one polished so often it held a memory of light even when the room was dim. Her face there was not young, but it was not weary either. It was the face of someone who had learned the weight of nights and how to carry them like folded blankets. She was not surprised when the door sighed again. She did not startle when the hinges whispered. She did not ask, "Who is there?" Because in this city, at this hour, people came for reasons their voices could not yet shape. She simply turned the lamp up one notch and let its circle expand to receive whomever the night had put at her threshold. A man entered this time older than the girl's father must have been, but with the kind of age that stays slim on the bones. He wore a tunic of modest cloth, precise in its mending, and boots that had been rubbed with care, as if the leather knew it could ask for kindness and get it. His beard was close-trimmed. His gaze, when he raised it to meet Matilde's, was that of a schoolmaster who has learned to look in a way that makes children tell the truth. "Master Matilde," he said, and the voice had vowels from farther north. "Matilde only," she replied with the same smile she gave everyone. "What would help you?" He set nothing on the counter. He drew no ring, no folded note, and no sealed vial that wanted refilling. Instead, he placed his hands flat on the wood and looked at them as if they were instruments he had borrowed long ago and now wished to return. "I am learning to sleep," he said, "and I do not know how." She did not look at the back room. She did not reach for the empty place where the notch-marked vial had been. She simply nodded, as if he had told her he wished to learn a new hand with a pen. "Sometimes," she said, "sleep must be taught as if it were a child who has grown too tall for its bed. It must be shown the doorway from waking without being pushed through. I do not wish for a potion that will shut the door," he said quickly. "I have tried draughts. They put me in a lake and I wake choking. I want to learn how to stand in the dark and not think of water." Matilde's eyes warmed. "You have already begun, then," she said, "to ask for learning instead of swallowing." She gestured to the chair. "Sit, if you please." She poured a little water into a goblet and folded into the water, nothing but her own steady presence. "Tell me what you do when the candle is out." "I count," he said, "as if counting were a rope, but it becomes a chain." "Then you will sing," she said, "under your breath, if you cannot bear more. 3 notes, only 3. They will not be grand. They will be small as bees. I will give you a melody that knows how to fly in circles until the circle is larger than your fear." She took up her quill and drew 3 small notes on a scrap, though he may not have read music. She sang them a simple lull of intervals anyone could hum. The cat looked up, surprised but not disapproving. "And your hands," she continued, "will rest on your ribs." You will feel the movement and decide to like it. If you cannot like it, you will decide not to dislike it. You will rock as if you were a boat tied to a shore ring in the harbor. If your mind must think, let it think of what your fingers touched today that was kind, the grain of a table, the cuff of a child's sleeve, the underleaves of a tree. He listened as if each instruction were a pebble and he were building, with pebbles, a path that crossed a shallow stream. When she finished, he bowed, and it was not a courtesy. It was trust made visible. It was then that Matilde understood the second secret, that she had not been waiting for the girl or for the tinkering of dew and wax. She had been waiting for the city to learn the gentler use of its own nights. This man was part of that learning. She felt a calm urgency, the way a page feels in the hand of a copyist who knows the light is failing and yet also knows his hand will find the line. "You may leave coin," she said when he asked, and he did, folding copper into the dish as if paying at a wayside chapel. He left without asking for a flask or a jar. He carried only the 3 notes and the image of his hands on his own ribs. Matilde watched the door close, and in the quiet that followed she heard the city breathe, briefly, like a child who had slept at last. She returned to the ledger. "Before I sleep, remember to teach sleep to those who fear it. Begin with music, then breathe, then a small light placed not to banish darkness, but to be something the darkness can be near without harm." She capped her ink and washed the nib, because nibs must be washed, as bodies must be, before rest. She banked the lamp to a glow that made the room look like honey poured thinly over wood. She lay down on the narrow bed tucked behind the back room door and turned her face to the little window where the night could speak in the language of cooling roofs and late owls. Her last thought, if it could be called a thought, was a single word: gentler. Somewhere across the city, a father, perhaps a magistrate, perhaps merely a man, sat with a vial in his palm and watched the light on his wall grow delicate. He listened. He had been a child once. He had learned to climb stairs, to read, to ride. Perhaps he could learn this, too. He placed one drop on his tongue. He touched his wrists. He left a door slightly open and discovered that the doorway did not speak of thieves, but of trees, of air, of breathing, of leaving room for the morning to enter when it was ready. Matilde slept, and the shop slept with her. Herbs leaning into their strings, jars pressing their mouths gently against their stoppers. The cat, whose duty it was to weigh the dark and announce if it grew too heavy, fell into a doze so even that the darkness forgot to be proud and instead became, for a while, merely shade in which dreams could grow. And though our tale has much more to wander through gardens where moonflowers teach the tongue new vowels, through records written in inks that keep secrets and inks that erase them, through an old memory that will ask to be known and a silver vial that will ask to be opened, we have arrived safely at our first resting place. Breathe once more, deeply, and let what is old inside you notice what is new. Not the promise of no fear, but a door that does not scold when you open it. Not the command to sleep, but the kindness to keep company until you do. Chapter 2. Moonflowers and the Ledger of Sleep. Morning arrived as if poured, thin and warm, into the narrow lanes. The bells counted prime, and the city's shutters opened like eyelids after a kind dream. Matilde stood in her doorway a little while, letting the gold of it settle on her hands. She had wrapped the saffron honey in cloth and tied it with a thread of green. The bundle gave a small, comfortable weight to her basket as she stepped onto the street. To walk through a waking city with medicines is to pass from one hush into another, each home holding its own climate of breath and bread, of laughter and unspilled tears. Matilde carried both, remedies and listening. In the weaver's lane, she left a jar of marshmallow root to ease a cough that had clung all winter to a boy who sucked threads in concentration at his loom. At the baker's back door, she set the honey and called softly so as not to startle the old woman, who arrived, wiping her hands on her apron in small circles of flour. They sat together on the stoop where the air was warmed by ovens, and Matilde watched the old woman taste the saffron on the tip of a spoon, the way one touches the surface of a river with a finger to learn its mood. The woman closed her eyes and smiled, not with mouth, but with face. "It is like a small son," she said. "Take it as if you were reading a letter from a friend who never forgets your name," Matilde said. And the woman nodded, as if someone had finally arrived at the right door. By tiers the market had gathered, greens lifted from damp baskets, pottery clinking like a language. Matilde bartered for linen thread, thumbed a row of stoppers until she found the one whose cork felt most like willing bark beneath her fingers, and bought chamomile from a woman who had gathered it at the river's edge, while the mist still lay over the reeds. The woman raised an eyebrow in greeting. "You always choose the ones with the petals a little uneven," she noted. "They remember the wind," Matilde replied, and they smiled the smile of those who notice similar things. When she returned to the shop, a folded scrap waited on her step, a pouch knotted with rough twine. She stooped. It was lighter than copper would be. Inside, wrapped as carefully as a child wraps a pebble, lay a small token of bone carved with the city's seal, and, beneath it, 3 words. "Fewer candles, father." The hand was the girl's. The word father had been written as if her mouth shaped it while her quill moved. Matilde felt the news ripple through her chest, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the loosening of a something that had been cinched. She tucked the token into the little wooden dish where she kept harmless, meaningful things. The seed of a fruit an embarrassed boy had given her when he could not afford coin for a salve. The curl of a ribbon a widow had untied from her hair when she chose to sleep without grief's badge, a burnt match whose single use had brought laughter to a room. The shop's noon held quiet the way some people hold a page while they decide whether to turn it. Matilde restocked the shelf where the mint lived. She ground willow bark until its powder became a cloud of memory how often this tree had beckoned wanderers to sit under it and remember. They were not made to carry everything at once. She wrote 3 lines in her ledger in the wash-ink hand she reserved for truths that did not need to be loud. The father slept with 1 candle less. The city is learning to be visited by its nights. She was binding a bunch of time when the guild inspector arrived, as such men often arrive at a time designed to feel like a surprise and a pity. He was young enough that his beard grew reluctantly and old enough to have mastered the art of looking both apologetic and official. "Master Matilde," he began, already in error. "Matilde," she said, easily, and slid the bunch of thyme into the shadow of her elbow like a child pushed gently behind a mother's skirt. He cleared his throat in a way that suggested it was part of the script. "The guild respects your practice," he said. "There has been talk, however, a talk not of wrongdoing, you understand, but of tendency. They say you keep the door open late. You receive folk at hours when respectable shutters are closed. It is the nature of certain pain to stand at the threshold of midnight and ask to enter," Matilde answered. "I do not refuse. I do not sell spectacle. I teach sleep." The guildman's eyes flicked to the shelves, to the back room door with its unboastful X, to the ledger at her elbow. He was not crude. He was, if anything, slightly afraid in the manner of those who have heard rumor call a thing mystery because they cannot quite tell which box of rules to set it in. There is also, he said more softly, as if words could bruise. A page. An old one. It is said you keep a page not copied from our sanctioned herbals. Matilde did not reach for the page. It lay where it always lay, between two slivers of wood-like cheekbones. She did not feel guilt. She felt the careful weight a bridge carries when it knows children are running across it and does not want them to fall. There is a page, she said. It teaches a song, not a draught. It says that night is not an element one takes into the body, but a room one learns to walk through without knocking over the furniture. Songs, the guildman repeated, trying to decide if the word belonged in an apothecary's inventory. Your clients sing. Sometimes humming gives fear something to follow, Matilde answered. That way, it does not run ahead and shout. It is unusual, he said. His eyes, spare and not unkind, slid once more around the room as if to reassure themselves that the walls were the same walls as in other daylight hours. Some of the brothers say this is too much like teaching the soul, Matilde finished for him, gently. And I say that the body where sleep lives is a house with a chapel in it, and a kitchen, and a bench for mending. If you forbid me the chapel's word, I will use the kitchens. If you forbid me the kitchens, I will use the benches. It is all one roof. He stood with his hands correct at his sides, and looked at a jar of fennel, as if it might declare allegiance. No accusations, he said at last, retreat cresting in his voice. Only watchfulness. The guild is watched. We must seem to watch. And who watches your sleep? Matilde asked, not to cut, but to place a small stone where a path might begin. He blinked once, almost childlike. I have, lately, been having the sort of dreams that require me to count the edges of my own hands in the morning, to be sure. They are still mine. The admission slipped out the way a sheep slips through a gap in a fence before anyone means to leave it open. Matilde's face did not move toward triumph. It moved toward hospitality. Here is what you will do tonight, she said, picking up her quill not as a weapon but as a ladle to pour instruction with. You will take a thread of linen. You will tie a knot for each bell from vespers to compline. You will hold the thread when you lie down. You will say to the thread, I am longer than the dark between these knots. If your hands forget to believe you, hum 3 notes, so simple even a child could not fail to find them, and you will place a sprig of thyme beneath your pillow to remind your breath of kitchens. He nodded, head lowered in that grudging, grateful way of men who have been given something they did not know they were allowed to need. When he left, he did not look over his shoulder as inspectors often do. He stepped into the day like a man whose path has widened. The cat leapt silently to the sill and watched him go, then glanced back at Matilde with an expression that, if it could be read, might have said, You are not a witch, you are a porch. By none the street's heat had begun to climb the air in little waves that made the shadows look like pools. Matilde closed the shutters partway to keep the room temperate, and in that soft dimness she took out the page. She did not unfold it hungrily. She laid it flat, as one lays a cloth on an altar for common bread. The ink had browned into that tender colour secret writing acquires when it has lived long under thumb and breath. It was not a recipe. There was no list of drams or scruples, no instruction to boil or beat or decant. There were lines, poem, prayer, practice. It mattered little which name one chose. Take the night as you would take a friend's cloak, not to become him, but to keep your shoulders from the rain. Call each fear by the name you learned for it in childhood, for the child is the one who knows where the doors are. Leave something ajar that is yours, not a gate, a drawer, a thought, the hand you do not hide in sleep. Sing in threes. Breathe as if your ribs were linden boughs. When the dark offers you a mirror, teach it a window. Matilde read and did not read. To read it was to let it move through her like water that remembers the shape of a channel. She had kept this page since the year her father died, a winter when snow came early and stayed as if it had taken a vow. He had written no farewell, no instructions to carry, nothing of coin or inventory. He had left only this, one prized page, whose absence from a book had probably made some monk in some scriptorium blink and sigh. The page meant, as far as Matilde had managed to name it, simply this, that a cure sometimes is a corridor. She placed the slivers of wood around it and returned it to its place. A shadow moved at the door and became a woman. Midwife's hands clean, short-nailed and quick. A scarf tied in a knot at the back, the knot smart. The fabric frayed at the edges where it had done years of service in steam and whisper and the urgency of shoulders needing to push and then rest. Heard you were making lullabies for men, the midwife said, without malice. I am teaching them to carry themselves to bed, Matilde replied. The midwife nodded. I have come for sleep, too. Not mine, she added, but for a woman whose grief keeps her awake as if grief were a rooster. They stood in the same circle of lamplight for a moment, to practitioners who knew the weight of bodies and the weather of breath. Matilde set her palm on the counter the way one sets a hand on the shoulder of a friend. Loss remembers itself at night, she said. We will not argue with the memory. We will be kind to it until it grows less proud. I will give you linden and a leaf of lemon balm to steep where she sits. I will write her a way to hold her breathing, as if it were a child who woke and cannot say why. Forgetting is not the plan, the midwife said, as if reminding some small, listening god. No, Matilde said, there is a balm for remembering without burning. She took out a small jar. It held a small jar. It held a salve that smelled faintly of bees and the sweet end of summer. Have her rub this at her temples and behind the ears, where secrets rest. Then let her tell her grief a story and stop in the middle, exactly in the middle, and promise to continue tomorrow. It is important that grief be given a tomorrow. That isn't only grief. The midwife looked at the jar as if it were a boat, and then at Matilde as if Matilde were a competent river, and price. She asked in the plain tone of those who know how modestly coin moves between need and remedy. A birth, Matilde said lightly, not in coin. When you catch a child in spring, tell the mother a story you like about your own mother. This will be our exchange. Done, said the midwife, slipping the jar into the cloth bag she wore at her hip, where she kept twine and soap and the thin-bladed scissors that cut umbilicus and thread with equal respect. There is one more thing. A whisper goes about your street. It says someone will come in the dark to ask you to bring a page you keep. I am only telling you in case knowing first might make you safer. Matilde smiled, that careful line between humor and alertness. I will leave my door as I leave it, she said. Ajar enough to let kindness in, closed enough to make mischief knock. They talked of births past, present, timed with moons, and then the midwife left with her bag of ordinary holy things. The afternoon thinned, turned to amber, then to the water blue of early vespers. Matilde steeped her own cup of chamomile and sat by the small back garden where moonflowers ran their pale grammar up a trellis. Each evening they rehearsed what they would say when the son's schoolteacher turned his back. She had planted them because of their honesty. They opened precisely when they wished to be seen and had nothing to prove at noon. As the first unfurled, the cat leaped up to take its place on the sill and made the small chirrup cats make when they have witnessed something delicate done correctly. "Shall I tell you?" Matilde asked aloud, not expecting an answer. "The secret I have been brewing longer than any tincture." The garden held its breath respectfully. "It is this, that our city needs a rite at midnight that does not belong to fear. Bells ring for hours, for weddings and fires and death. But there is no bell that rings for the small courage of closing one's eyes. I mean to make one. Not a bell," she added, because bells were dear and required permissions often granted to men with lists and not to women with gardens. A ritual, a thing one can do without priest or purse. A string, a sprig, 3 notes, a door left tender. I will write it as a recipe and leave it in the market where hands can take it without names." The cat slowly shut its eyes in that silent assent only a cat can give. Not approval, exactly, but a willingness to share the house with a new idea. Matilde set her cup aside and began to write. Not in the pale ink ledger this time, but on a plainer sheet that could be copied without heartbreak if it were lost. She wrote in a hand that cobblers and cobblers' wives could read. "A small rite for midnight. Tie a thread and not the bells. Place a sprig where breath will remember kitchens. Leave a familiar door slightly open. Hum 3 notes. Place your hands upon your ribs and decide not to dislike the movement. Tell the dark one beautiful thing you remember. If you have a friend, trade a token before sleep and return it in the morning. This is to remind you that breath is a choir." On the back she drew a simple trefoil and beneath it wrote, not her name, but a small dot for each house on her street. Let the city see itself in what helped it. Night dropped its soft nets. The bells counted compline, and the last light withdrew into the stones like wine returning to the shadow of the jug. Matilde set the paper on the counter to dry and trimmed the lamp to a flame that could be looked at without squinting. She was not surprised when she felt, before she heard, the night thicken outside her door, as if a cloud had entered the narrow alley. Sometimes the city's officialness comes not as a man or a badge, but as an atmosphere careful, deliberate, scentless as iron. The latch lifted with courtesy. A tall man entered, not in a cloak this time, but in the ordinary tunic of one who has chosen not to announce himself. Yet ordinariness is a costume like any other, and this one fit as if tailored by someone who knew the measurements of rank. He stood with his weight exactly balanced, and let the room tell him what kind of door it was. He did not take the chair. He did not touch the counter. He looked at the moonflowers on the sill, as if they were a form of alphabets. "I have come," he said simply, "about a page." Matilde lifted her gaze without hurry. She had folded the page and returned it to its resting place after vespers, as was her custom. Her lamp showed the lines of her face without hurry or fear. "Many pages live here," she said. The truth served plain. "It is a house where books share shelves with jars. This one," he said, "is torn." "Torn pages are often where the best work begins," she replied. He studied her, as if measuring a bridge's span. At last he said, "You gave a vial to my daughter, and she brought me back news that the night is kinder by 1 candle," Matilde said, and there was a tone, not of defense, but of participation, as if they were talking about the same river from different banks. He exhaled. A man who has been keeping himself still and legal all day allows himself, finally, 1 breath with warmth in it. "There is a paper," he said again, "which my father once spoke of in a winter when his guard was lowered by fever. It taught so, he said, men how to stand before their fear without giving it a crown. He said it was kept in this city where the Linden trees were planted when the charters were signed. He was not a man to lie about such a thing." I traced it to your door. Matilde looked not at his clothes or his hands now, but at what lived in the muscles near his throat, an old tightening, a chain the body had mistaken for a collar. I have a page, she said. It speaks like water put into the hand. It does not belong to men alone. It is for those who have allowed fear to have larger furniture than it deserves. She did not reach for it. Why do you want it? So that I may make a law from it, he answered, without ornament, a custom, a public ordinance, if you like, that each household must practice some small rite before sleep, leave a door unlatched, sing 3 notes. Not enforced by fines, he added, hearing himself and stepping away from severity, but asked, spoken aloud by the bellman as he walks. As natural as calling the hour, the cat, who disliked laws almost as much as it disliked late dinner, rose and flicked its tail. But Matilde felt a thought open like a linden leaf after rain. She had imagined a ritual the city could take without asking. Here was the city asking to carry it further than she could, past doors that did not know her name. What you would make, she said, searching for a phrase that would make sense in a hall with flags, is a courtesy. A civic courtesy toward sleep. He startled almost imperceptibly and then smiled. The kind of smile men smile when something within them takes off a heavy hat. Yes, he said, a courtesy. You cannot have the page, Matilde said, like a mother saying no to a child who wants the hearth. But I will copy its sense, and you may write it in the city's voice. She turned, fetched a clean sheet, and wrote, in the simplest language she could make, that was still true. The shape of the page, a city's courtesy at nightfall. Let each house practice one gesture of goodwill toward the night. A door kept a finger width open, 3 notes hummed. A sprig hung where breath can find it. A story left for tomorrow to finish. Let the watch call it, as he calls the hour, not as command, but as invitation. Neighbors, leave your small door kinder. Good night. She sanded the ink. She did not add her name. She did not hide it either. She blew, and the letters settled into the paper with the gravity of ink committing itself to fiber. He took the page and read it as if listening to a choir beyond the door. I will call it, he said, the Linden courtesy. Call it what you like, so long as it is called, Matilde answered, and teach your own heart to answer. He placed on the counter, not coin, but his palm, an oath without witnesses, signed with skin. Then he left in a step, like the lifting of a weight. The hours between Compline and the first slim slice of matins belonged to secrets and 2 very practical things: banking fires, checking the latch twice, laying out the clothes for morning, so one need not squint and stumble. Matilde kept her own house in that wise ritual. She carried a bowl to the back garden, held it under a moonflower, and gathered the dew that had settled briefly on the lip of its pale throat. There is nothing miraculous in such dew. Its virtue is mostly symbolic. But symbols are houses where the body can sleep while the soul walks about. She tipped 1 drop onto her finger and touched it to her own wrist. We are not enemies, she told the dark, practicing what she taught. You and I have walls in common. Only when she banked the lamp to a kinder ember did she see, beneath the door, the shadow of a folded note. She lifted the latch and found it resting like a moth pale, quiet, patient. The hand that had written it was controlled but not cold. Each letter stood the way a watchman stands when wind and danger are both possibilities. At the bell between 12 and 1, bring the page, no signature. Not the daughter's hand, not the magistrate's, not the guildman's, not the midwife's, whose letters were jaunty with useful haste. Matilde held the note a long time, as if warmth could make its source confess itself. It did not. She folded it once, twice, until it was no larger than a fingernail, and set it under the foot of the lamp. She sat. She did not hurry, and she did not ignore it. She allowed the request to share the room with her breathing. Then she took out her ledger and wrote, because some anxieties can be swallowed without harm, if they are first given a line to cling to. A note asked for the page. No threat in it, only a habit of command. Midnight will bring the decency or indecency of the asker to light. I will not carry the page into a hand that only knows how to take. If the hand can receive, I will teach. She stood and went to the back room. The door with the X received her like an old friend who gives good silence. She unwrapped the page and looked at it a long time. It was not a relic. It was paper with ink, a good idea living in a body that had survived. Yet her father's breath was in it, because breath is what turns ideas into a kind of bread. She folded the page again and placed it where it lived, between the slivers of wood, the thin bones that had held it safe all these years. She waited, not in the way of hunted things, in the way of midwives and watchmen and lighthouse keepers, attentive, calm, ready to let what will come arrive without meeting it with either panic or pride. The cat took its post, as if enlisted, half asleep, wholly aware. The lamp made a small lake on the counter. The moonflower outside continued its quiet grammar lesson on opening. When the bell counted midnight, its last tone drifted like a leaf on water. Matilde stood and loosened the latch, not because she had been commanded, but because midnight is a threshold worth acknowledging. The street's breath changed, as though someone standing somewhere had finally exhaled. A figure filled the doorway, sunlight opposite. It carried not light, but its own sort of clarity. Not tall, not bent, cloaked, careful. It did not smell of horses or smoke. It did not look around greedily. It made, instead, the gesture of a student. It removed its hood and bowed not to Matilde's status, which she did not have, but to her house. The face was lean, the eyes well used. They were the eyes of a scribe who has copied things he did not agree with and things that kept him alive. His fingers were stained not with earth but with ink. He held nothing. "I came with empty hands," he said, answering, without knowing it, a condition Matilde had not voiced. His voice carried the quiet of cloisters and the creak of long benchboards. "I serve in the scriptorium near St. Benoit. Years ago, a page was torn from a book I was meant to keep spotless. I scrubbed the margin until the ghost of writing dwindled, and still I could see where what had been worth keeping was missing. A boy carried the page because a man asked him, and the boy pressed it flat in his coat until it learned the shape of his heart. That boy is an old man now. He told me the page lived with you. I have copied many proud things, wars and laws, a king's spelling of his own name. None of them taught me how to teach my heart not to stand like a gate in wind. I asked to see the page, to learn not to own." Matilde felt something beautiful and simple occur in the architecture of the moment. The press of a request into the shape of an answer that did not bruise. She went to the back room, brought the page, and set it between them on the counter as one sets bread. The scribe looked and did not touch. He read it once as one reads orders. He read it again as one reads a hymn learned as a child and forgotten under the weight of adult memory. 3 notes, he murmured. A door ajar. A sprig where breath remembers kitchens. He smiled at the last. A small boy's smile borrowed briefly by an old man's face. "May I copy this into my bones?" "You may," Matilde said. "I will write you a simple copy for your hand to follow as well." She did. In unadorned script, leaving space between lines as one leaves paths wide enough for two to walk abreast. When she handed it to him, he touched it with gratitude. "I once believed," he said, "that the best pages were those with the most words. Tonight I learn that the best pages are those that make a room." "Then make a room," Matilde said. "In your house, in your scriptorium, in the city. Let those who copy proud things learn to copy kindness without shame." He bowed again, making the air around him feel briefly more orderly in a good way, and stepped back into the alley's kind dark. Matilde watched him go. She was no longer worried about the first note. Another may come with the wrong hand, but this one had come in the right shape. She closed the door, not fully. She left it as she always left it. A finger width that said neither yes nor no, but "I am here." She banked the lamp, laid a thread of linen across the ledger like a road that would be there again in the morning, and carried her breath toward rest like a lit candle cupped by both hands. Before she slept, she wrote on the plain sheet again, adding one line beneath the Linden courtesy. "If you cannot sing, hum the sound of someone you loved speaking your name." Outside, the watchman called the hour, and because of a page and a conversation and a girl who wrote father shyly, his voice added something new, not as order but as invitation. "Neighbors, leave your small door kinder. Good night." The city listened. Some doors shifted. Some threads were tied. Somewhere a magistrate let his hand fall away from the second candle and found the darkness did not leap. Somewhere a guildman placed time beneath his pillow and woke to find his dreams had edges he could count and keep. Somewhere a widow said aloud the first two lines of a story and fell asleep waiting for the third, and in the morning she remembered the promise more than the sorrow. And Matilde, who had tended 100 nights with jars and patience, felt for the first time that the night itself had brought her a remedy, a scribe, a father, a girl, a midwife, a city willing to make courtesy to its own sleep. She turned onto her side, hands easy at her ribs, and listened to the moonflower opening like a book teaching itself how to be read in the dark. Chapter 3. The Watchman and the Unlit Door. The watchman's lantern described a little orange world that moved when he moved, a portable sunrise carried on a hook. The rest of the night arranged itself around his light the way water arranges around a stone, flowing, attentive, occasionally singing in the throat of a gutter. He was not a young man and not an old one, and like middle hours, he worked by knitting together what had come before with what would come after. He wore a cloak with patches he had sewn himself, each piece the colour of something sensible: bread heel, pewter, wet flint, and a handful of soil taken from the garden that backs onto the linden trees by the west gate. His name was Jagan, though most people knew him by the bell and the call, the hour and whatever kindness or warning the hour required. Tonight, after the new words had crossed his lips for the first time, neighbors, leave your small door kinder, the night itself seemed to lean its ear toward him. Strange, he thought, without anxiety, how a sentence can change the shape of the road beneath a foot. He tested the phrase again, softly, letting it fall like a seed in front of each house he passed. The houses took the seeds in different ways. A baker's door shifted with quick willingness, a man used to leaving warmth behind him without fear. A notary's did not budge, but a curtain twitched as if a thought inside the house had lifted its head. A widow's already sat ajar, as if she had been waiting for permission long before permission took a name. Somewhere a hound muttered sleepily without offering an argument. The linden trees took no notice. They were busy with their soft court of moths. Jang did the other things his duty required, checking shutters, listening for mischief's particular rhythm, pausing to make sure the brass finial on the fountain had taken its polish well from the day's sun, but he did them inside the new sentence, as if he walked under an arch made of words. He passed Matilde's door last of all, by custom and by courtesy, for he preferred to keep her quiet near the end of his hour, when his voice had grown companionable with the dark. Her lamp made its polite circle on the street, and Jane lifted his lantern in return. Two small lights bowing to one another like neighbors. He called the hour and the invitation. Then he moved on, not out of disinterest, but from a sense that some doors prefer to be called and then left alone to answer in their own way. In the shop, Matilde heard him and smiled by instinct, the way a sleeper smiles when a dream arrives that remembers her name. She sat with a scrap of cloth across her lap, mending a bag whose seam had held years of chamomile and asked now to be remembered with the needle. The cat lay like an untied ribbon near her ankles. When John's voice had thinned into distance, she set needle and bag aside and stood, feeling in her ribs that quiet widening which comes of gratitude, even when gratitude cannot decide exactly which cupboard it belongs in. She thought of the night as a teacher, and the watchman's call as the tapping of a stick along the lesson's margin. Here, here, do not forget this bit. She poured water into a shallow dish, put into it a few slices of apple for sweetness and aniseed to make the air remember kitchens, and carried it to the sill, a small offering to moths and to the moonflower that tilted its face like a little bell with its clapper of scent. For your students, she told the knight. And for hours, the first to come that hour was not troubled. She came the way a stream comes, deliberate, flowing through its banks without apology, tall, with shoulders that had learned to carry the weight of opinions. She wore a dress, the colour of faded plum, and a veil that whispered of chapels where she had been named, sometimes lady and sometimes daughter, but too seldom tired. She sat without waiting to be told to sit, and set her gloves on the counter with the care one gives to a creature who feels the weather in its bones. I cannot bear a crowded room, she said without preamble. Some rooms are crowded even when only to sit within them. Candles talk too much when there are many, and so do men who own a great number of words. I come away with my head singing like a market stall caught in a wind. For 3 nights now I have not slept until the birds have begun to bend the dawn. Matilde listened and heard the shape of a remedy, even before she turned to jars. Too much light leaves bruises, she said mildly. You do not notice until you lay your head on the pillow and find the bruise beneath it. I will not give you dark to fight light. I will give you shade. She moved along the shelf and took down a packet of linden blossom, child of shade, and a small jar of poppy milk, so weak it acted more like a kindness than a chain. Into the prescription she put not quantities first, but gestures. In the hour before sleep, ask for 1 light only, and let it be behind you rather than in front. Sit with your back to a book. If a thought comes hammering to make law within your skull, lay a hand on your hair as your mother did when you were small and say to it, Tomorrow, tomorrow, tonight we do not legislate. We rock the lady because she was one. The room carried the echo of rooms she carried with her, exhaled in a way that sounded like an unlocked door. To be told to rock, she said, without being thought childish. Rocking is a form of courage, Matilde replied. If it were not, why would boats do it all night in harbours without shame? She wrote the instructions again, this time in the plain cursive that travels easily, and sent the woman away with a bundle that smelled of orchards and soft green air. The street returned to its economical quiet. A boy ran by with a basket and did not look in. 2 men passed speaking very low, the way men do when they carry the same news and are not yet ready to let it out where wind might alter it. The watchman's bell kissed the next hour, and Matilda knew, by the taste of the silence between chimes, that something anxious would arrive. It came as a scratch at the door, not a knock, the gesture of a creature who has learned to ask quietly, so as not to be refused. When the latch lifted of its own good manners, a small figure slipped in and then hesitated, as if the room were a sea watched for waves. 12 years old, perhaps, with shoulders remembering a load set on them too often for someone who still wore a child's shirt. The shoes were city shoes surrounded by country miles, their stitching brave but tired. His hair stuck up in 3 honest attempts at obedience. He held nothing. He held too many things. Matilda gestured him toward the chair. "You may sit," she said, "or you may stand and count the herbs until the counting grows kind. I do either when I'm not sure how to begin talking." The boy looked at the shelf and whispered, "1 to many. Many is an excellent number," Matilda said, "especially for fears. It tells the truth without making a list." She waited until the boy's breath remembered that it had been made to go in and out without permission. "What has the night done? It has taken my father's boarder," he said in a rush, and then, seeing her face neither flinch nor misjudge, he tried again. "He is a mason. When day ends, his hands make sense. He can hold a stone and feel where it is crooked. But at night the wall he is building goes sideways and turns into something that does not keep anything in or out. He wakes and shouts, and I cannot keep him from frightening the baby. I try to stop him with my hands, and he calls me naughty. But in the morning he holds my hands like they are bread." Matilda felt the old ache that comes to those who keep watch in the houses where love forgets itself before it remembers again. "You cannot carry his wall," she said, "but you can give his hands a stone to hold that will not injure anyone at midnight. Do you see that jar?" She pointed to pebbles in a bowl, river-polished, cool as silver when lifted. "Take 2 and put them in a basin by his bed. When he wakes, teach him to put his palms on them. Teach him to say, 'Stone is cool, palm is warm.' This is a real wall I am making now, not a dream. You will have to teach him more than once. Will you be his teacher?" The boy nodded without pride. "I will teach he, and he will forget, and I will teach him again," he said in a voice that had worn the coat of vows before. Matilda gave him a sprig of thyme to hang from a nail kitchen courage, and, because she recognized the hunger behind the eyes that had walked too far, she wrapped 2 rustic biscuits in a bit of linen, as if she were mummifying a king. He tucked the bundle into his shirt with the reverence bread always deserves. When he was half out the door, he pivoted back and said the thing he had been carrying like a hot stone. "Too hot to keep, too important to drop. Will the city keep telling us to leave our doors kinder?" "It will," Matilda said. "Even when it forgets, it will remember again. And in the meantime, you may tell the door yourself." The boy seemed to grow half an inch just from being told he had jurisdiction over a threshold. He ran, and his running did not jostle the biscuits into breaking. After he left, the watchman ghosted by again, lantern low, and tapped twice on the lintel, a courtesy knitted between one who called the hour and one who measured it with herbs. Matilda lifted her hand in answer. She thought of the boy, and of his father's hands, and of the cool stones, and then of the thin old scribe, copying the way one copies a blessing, into a book to make the margin feel less lonely. She drew her ledger nearer and wrote, "For fear that piles walls in the dark, give the hands a stone that is not imagined. Teach skin to remind the mind it is here, not in the dream." When she lifted her face again, the room had adjusted itself to a new quiet. the kind of quiet that follows on an agreement. Someone would arrive now who wished to argue not to be cruel. But because the city, like any creature, sometimes defends itself against new kindness, as if the kindness were a trick, it was the guildman, but his face tonight belonged less to the guild and more to his own dreams. He had time in his hair, and it made him look for a moment like a kitchen saint. He took the chair with the gravity of one who has seen something he must say and cannot delay, or his mouth will burn. "A woman came to me," he began, "just after none. She sells cloth in the market, a corner stall. She said her neighbor mocked her for leaving her curtain open a finger width, said thieves would think her simple. She asked whether the guild meant to enforce these invitations as law. I said no, and my mouth knew it spoke truth. And then I said more. I said, a city that cannot bear the sight of a small kindness will not be saved by any number of locks." Matilde hid her smile behind the very serious act of aligning a jar so its label faced front. "Your work tonight," she said, "was to sleep with time." "How did time treat you?" he answered, as a man who knows he has been seen does. "Honestly, I dreamt the market. Quiet," he said. "No shouting. Even the geese did not argue. A boy went past with a candle, and I did not tell him to keep it high. In the morning I counted my hands and found them mine." He paused, then added in a smaller voice, "It frightened me, the quiet. And then the fright went away as if it had heard its name and remembered how to go home." He looked up, a little sheepish. Is that what a remedy can do?" "It is exactly what a remedy can do," Matilde said. "When it is good, it does not bludgeon. It offers a direction and lets courage take the step." She gave him more time. Not because he would not buy it by the armful if she allowed, but because remedies are more obedient when they come in modest portions. "Also," she added, "you may tell the cloth seller that there is a way of leaving a curtain open that invites starlight, but not mischief. A sprig at the sill, a small bowl of water to say, 'This is a house that keeps watch,' and the watchman's call these make an invitation to sleep, not to theft." He left with a nod to the cat, who ignored him with exquisite diplomacy. The guildman's shoulders had lost something of their square, as if the corners had been sanded by time. The bells turned another hour. Matilde brewed herself a cup of Linden, and because she liked to lend her mind an occupation as the tea cooled to gentleness, she set a small brass scale on the counter and weighed news. On one pan she put the father and his fewer candles, the boy and his stones, the watchman and his friendlier call. On the other she placed the note that had arrived demanding the page, the mischief in the market that would prefer mockery to courtesy, the possibility that someone would try to turn invitation into law and law into theatre. The scale did not declare a winner. It did something better. It steadied. Balance, it said in its silent tongue, is a verb. There are hours in the night when people who are not used to asking for help dare to ask for it because the walls seem less official. It was at such an hour that a hand came to the latch and then withdrew and then returned. As if it had been arguing with itself in the corridor, the door opened and a figure stepped in whose cloak confessed an occupation no one advertises. A thief. Or anyway a man whose living ran along the edge of other people's belongings and called it cleverness. He had the lean kindness of cats and the restless kindness of someone who has been hungry when he did not deserve to be. He looked around, not with greed. Greed rarely looks. It only calculates, but with a craftsman's awareness. Jars, shelves, the small nails that held bunches of lavender like upside-down chandeliers. "I came," he said, "because there is talk of a page that can put men to sleep. I thought of uses." He lifted his hands and let them fall. "Then I thought of your door and how it is, and how people say you leave it almost open and yet nothing leaves without paying. He took a breath, the sort that tests whether a room will allow a man to say what he is not practiced at saying. I have not slept without sitting up, since I learned the shape of the city's stones with my back. Matilde's eyes took him in with the same acceptance she offered to jars and storms. The page does not put anyone to sleep, she said. It teaches how to greet a night. But I will copy for you what I have copied for others, and you will not use it to quiet men while you empty their belts, because that is not the kind of hunger you truly serve. Her tone did not scold, it named, you will sit with your back against a place that has a history of holding an altar, a tree, even a wall that has kept weather out longer than any man's pride. You will hum and count the knots between Vespers and Compline, and you will sleep. She paused. If you return to steal from me after I give you this, the cat will bite you and I will weep a little, and that is not a thing you wish to cause in your city. He laughed once, an honest laugh, surprised by himself. No, he said, I don't like weeping that comes from my work. I like only the kind that comes when someone hears their own name said kindly. If liking any weeping is a thing a man like me is permitted. He took the copied lines with care. He stood a long moment, looking at them as if the ink were a landscape. I will not make coin with this, he said, answering the invitation he had been given to be better than his craft. I will make a little sleep. It may be worth more. When he left, he retied the latch behind him with more respect than many honest men have for such hardware. Matilde's lamp had burned low enough now that its flame resembled a bead of honey. She trimmed it and listened. There is a sound the city makes when an idea begins to roost. It is the absence of another sound, the clatter of defensiveness, perhaps, or the creak of cynicism turning in its bed. The absence tugged at her ribs in a way that invited tears, the light kind that rinsed the corners, not the heavy kind that asked for days to carry them across. She permitted to and then closed the ledger to keep them from smudging the lines. When she rose to bank the lamp for good, a shape filled her doorway briefly, a pause, made of cloth and breath. The magistrate, though he still wore ordinary linen and not his day's costume, stood with his head bare and his hands empty. He did not cross the threshold. He did not make weight where weight was not needed. He said only this, my daughter slept. I slept. The door was open the width of a finger. When I dreamt that the corridor went sideways, I put my hands on my ribs and decided not to dislike the movement. In the morning I listened to the Watchman and found that I liked his voice. Matilde inclined her head. That is the kind of news the knight hopes to hear, she said. Keep telling it. He left no coin, no name, and no decree. He left air moved by gratitude and a faint compounded scent of linden, beeswax, and humility, an unlikely but excellent perfume for a city's leader. When he had gone, and when the watchman's bell spoke of the small hour that leans against the wall like a boy who has run out of breath, Matilde did what she seldom did. She stepped outside, not far. Her house would not have liked it. She stood in the street and looked up at the slice of sky the storybook roofs allowed. 2 stars, 2 lanterns, a moth, a moonstone of cloud. She imagined the page copied again by the scribe, now home and humming over his bowl of soup. She imagined the boy placing cool stones in the basin. She imagined the thief leaning his back against an honest wall. She imagined the lady counting the places where light could be kind instead of proud. She imagined the guildman laughing, for once, in a dream he did not have to explain. She returned to her chair and, with the smile of one who has been given a task that is large but not cruel, began to write the city's midnight rite again and again, in a hand that even tired eyes could read. She would pin one at the baker's in the dawn, tuck one into the weave of the Linden fence near the west gate, leave one in the notch of a bench near the fountain where the geese practiced their insolence. She wrote until the lamp warmed the paper at her elbow, and the shadows on the wall formed gentle choruses that spoke in the language of sleep, before she finally lay down behind the lattice of her own door left kindly ajar. She added one more line to the ritual, a line that had waited to name itself all evening. If you wake and find fear sitting at the foot of your bed, ask it softly whether it came to be warmed. Give it a corner of the blanket. Fear, like a stray cat, will choose the floor by morning. The cat, hearing its species offered as a grammar for mercy, rolled and pressed its chin to the boards with the gratitude of small monarchs. Matilde smiled without teeth, the way people smile when they do not wish to wake the other sleepers in the world, and closed her eyes. The watchman called the hour and, almost shyly because he was still learning the weight of it, added the new invitation. Doors shifted, threads were counted. 3 notes moved through the city like bees traveling between gardens that had decided to be neighbors. The linden trees stood and did what trees do best. They remembered without insisting, listened without correcting, kept the air mild along their avenue, so that those who had to walk even in the small hours would feel that they were accompanied. And because trees are diplomats between earth and sky, they took the city's first attempts at courtesy and lifted them among the moths, where such attempts learn to glow. Outside the shop, dew collected in the bowls left for it by a woman who had learned that to teach sleep is to practice a kind of worship. Inside, the page slept between its 2 slivers of wood, like a letter that has arrived and does not need to be forwarded anymore. In the stillness, a very quiet thought moved across Matilde's resting mind, like a ship travelling in the dark by the faint whine of its ropes, that the secret she had been keeping all these nights was not merely a tincture or a torn page, but a city's capacity to become a softer shape without becoming weaker. The hour turned again. The bell kissed it. The watchman, far down the street now, let his voice drop into the lane where the poorest lived without asking leave, and said with more confidence than before, "Because a man will repeat what he learns is welcomed. Neighbors, leave your small door kinder. Good night." And the city, answering him without quite knowing it, had answered, shifted in its sleep like a child who has finally found the cool side of the pillow. Chapter 4. The Linden Walk. Morning tucked itself into the city like a shawl, edges neatly folded. The watchman's new words, "Neighbors, leave your small door kinder," had slept in many houses and woken in many mouths. Bakers repeated them to ovens, letting steam take the syllables. Washerwomen repeated them to basins, letting the water hold their shape for a moment before it forgot, as water forgets everything. Even the geese near the fountain honked a version of it, irreverent and genuine, as if announcing that they, too, understood courtesy when it came with crumbs. Matilde, opening her shutters, found on the sill 3 small tokens: a dried violet knotted to a string, a folded scrap that said only 1 candle now, and a child's drawing, 3 notes, drawn like birds, with tails taped to a sprig of thyme. She placed the violet among other little proofs that kindness returns by its own roots, and she held the drawing at arm's length so her whole chest could admire it. The street carried a breeze from the river. It smelled of cool iron and weedy sunlight. She watched Jan, the watchman, finish his walk with the precise fatigue of one who has done a good task and is reluctant to hand it back to time. He lifted his lantern toward her in greeting and came nearer, less to speak than to lean his day against someone who would not let it fall. "They answered," he said, softly, astonished. "They did," she answered, and poured him a little water in a pewter cup, so that the hour could shake itself off his throat. He drank the way plants drink, night dew, no spectacle, all gratitude. "I would make something of it," he said slowly, as if testing boards in a bridge. "Not a decree, a habit with a name. A walk, perhaps. At midnight on the 7th night from now, the street would come to their thresholds and hum the 3 notes. Doors left a finger open, threads knotted for the bells. A Linden walk, the 7th night," Matilde said. "Pleased by his choice, as one is pleased by the right spoon, set at the right place, in the right hour. 7 gives our bodies time to learn without scolding. Yes, a walk. I will copy small sheets for your rounds. The scribe will copy more. The midwife will carry them where births carry all news." She touched the ledger with the back of her hand. Joy made her cautious as she touched anything potent. Let it be a kindness that teaches itself. By tears, a crowd gathered in the market. Not a mob's crush, but the gentle accretion of curiosity. The cloth seller from the Guildman's Dream had her curtain a little open with a sprig pinned to the hem by a brass sewing pin. A tannery journeyman stood with his sleeves rolled, smelling of bark and labour, and argued not harshly, merely with the conviction of one who has learned safety by brews that thieves love doors left ajar, and thieves love fear, the midwife said, folding her arms like gates that decide when to swing. They smell it. This is not fear. This is an invitation to sleep. There's a difference your hands will know before your tongue does. They'll take the difference and weigh it in coin, he grumbled, but the edge of his voice had sanded itself a little. One of the hide sheds was turned over last night, he added. Whoever did it left the latch neat as prayer. We sleep softer and they move kinder. Maybe the 2 meet in the middle. Matilde, overhearing as she tied bunches of chamomile in the shade, thought of the thief who had come with honest hands and a hunger he did not like to cause. She watched the journeyman's face and chose, as she often chose, to leave the argument without a sermon. The city was thinking, and thinking should not be interrupted, like a child finally working sums without prompting. Near none, the magistrate's daughter arrived with a basket of small loaves, still warm. She placed one on Matilde's counter and another in John's hand where he stood, shy with gratitude and maintaining a little distance, as if not to salt the bread with the sweat of his night. "My father says," she announced in the voice of a girl permitted to carry her own truth, "that it is harder to command kindness than to invite it. And he would rather invite and fail than command and succeed the wrong way." She blinked, as if hearing the sentence again from outside herself. "He also says his sleep tastes of willow rather than smoke." Matilde smiled with her entire face. "May it keep tasting green," she said. "On the 7th night will he stand in his doorway. He will hum," she said, very serious, "where no one can see him. I will hum where everyone can." Jarjan tried the 3 notes under his breath and discovered, to his surprise and faint embarrassment, that singing in day held a different courage than singing at night. He hummed anyway. The scribe came in the afternoon, a little ink on his cuffs, like the starling spots he admired in autumn. He carried copies of the Linden Courtesy written with the prudent spacing of one who expects someone to learn them by candlelight. The brothers have hummed, he confessed, eyes bright, softly, so as not to frighten God. He put down the papers and leaned both palms on the counter, the way sailors lean on posts when land comes back under their feet. "The prior says humility has 3 notes, "And the choir will find a fourth," Matilde said, and they both grinned at the small liberty they had permitted themselves. They were still smiling when a man in a dark coat entered without rehearsal. He had the tidy hairlines of someone who clipped his thoughts with the same care he gave to his beard. On his finger, a signet ring lay like a command asleep. His boots made a clean sound. He looked at the sheets, at the jars, at Jang and the scribe, without disdain, merely the sort of fatigue officials feel after long days of asking questions. "There was theft at the tannery," he said to the heir. "We investigate. The city wishes you to know that doors open, kinda. However you name them are still doors." "They are," Matilde said peaceably, "and we teach the hands who knock and those who answer that kindness is a form of hinge." The man considered this without showing whether it had touched him. "Nevertheless," he said, "if anyone comes to sell sleep that is too easy or asks for coin to sprinkle on thresholds, you will inform the guard." "Sleep that is too easy is a rope," Matilde answered. "I sell bread and thread and songs. Ropes are the province of men who keep cells. And I inform the watchman," she added, "who walks while you sit." She handed him a copy of the Linden courtesy, and something duty, curiosity, the wish of a tired mind not to be proud for a moment made him take it. He left, and the heir felt better for being once again without the weight of his tidy boots. Evening came with the particular hush that follows rain remembered but not present. The light had the color of cooled iron. The streets smelted their day into shadow. Before vespers, the guildman returned, not to argue, but to stand near the counter and confess in the tone people use when they have decided to be harmless. "I sang," he said, "and for a time I did not think of the receipt I forgot to tally." Matilde had a small jar of lemon balm waiting. "For your desk," she said. "It will remind the heir of gardens." He took it and held it with the solemnity herbs require when they are asked to do simple work worth doing. The thief came by at twilight, clean, almost handsome in the way a cat can be handsome when it has not fought for a week. He placed on the counter a bracelet made of brass and a blue stone cheap as a sky bought in a market. "I did not take this," he said, "but I found it in an alley where a boy had hung it on a nail as if returning it to a wall." He glanced at the scribe and Jan and did not flinch at their presence. "If the tannery sends a man to ask, tell him a thief brought honesty and not to look surprised." Matilde nodded, received the bracelet like a message, and laid it in the dish where harmless, meaningful things lived. "How did the wall treat your back?" she asked. "It allowed me to belong to it for an hour," he said. "And the hour allowed me not to owe anyone a debt I could not pay." The seventh night approached under a sky that had practiced its darkness, until it found the right tone. Matilde copied, placed, folded. The scribe delivered, humming. The midwife told the new mothers and the women who would soon need them. They tucked the notes in baskets beneath blankets and onions. Jang walked and spoke. The words began to behave as if they already knew the streets. On the afternoon before, a canon from St. Benut arrived, robes carrying the clean chalk smell of chapels and the damp stone smell of old tales. He stood on the threshold without crossing it, a courtesy Matilde admired, then stepped in when she opened her hands in the way of a woman who opens jars for a living. "Sister," he said, without accuracy but with careful kindness, "your humming has reached our ears. I do not object to it. I come only to ask that you call it courtesy and not sacrament, lest the ignorant bless it wrongly and the proud curse it for the blessing." "We call it courtesy," Matilde said. "We leave sacraments to those who can keep fire without becoming smoke." He looked relieved, though his face did not admit such liberties. Then hum, he said quietly, and when you hum, perhaps hum toward the east for a heartbeat or two, enough for those whose work is altars to feel included. We like to be included when we are not being argued with. We like to be included, she agreed. She showed him the copy. He read it, smiled as much as a canon who wishes not to smile too much may smile, and left a sprig of rosemary on the counter as if paying his tithe to a garden. On the 7th night, the city brushed its teeth in basins, folded itches into shirts, counted threads. The linden trees along the west gate breathed their lime scent, subtle, almost honeyed. Moths made soft wind. Jan lit his lantern early to check latches and reminded his voice how to make the new words sit easy behind the old. He met Matilde at her threshold. She stood with the page laid away, with the copy pinned above the counter for those who wished to learn a line just before the hour. Ready? He asked. I am not a city, she said, but I am ready enough to hum. The bell struck 12. 1, 2, a dozen notes cast into the bowl of night. On the final tone, Jan called the hour, and then he called the invitation, and his voice already sounded like a custom rather than an experiment. Doors shifted, curtains made small sighs. On one street a hand placed a bowl of water on a sill. On another, a woman stroked the lintel as if smoothing a child's hair. A thin line of humming began tentative, neighborly, then truer as voices recognized themselves in one another. 3 notes, again, the human version of bees passing between flowers that have decided to be friends. The lady in the plum dress hummed in her doorway, veil catching lamp glow like river skin. The guildman hummed with the lemon balm open beside his ledger. The thief hummed with his back against the oldest wall by the linden trees. The magistrate, unseen, hummed inside his threshold. His daughter, seen, hummed where all could see and did not blush. The scribe hummed with the slow exactness of one who believes that if he gets the notes right on paper, the world will find it easier to play them. Matilde hummed, and the shop hummed with her. Jars answered the way well-made objects answered their makers. She left her door ajar. The cat sat with the grave dignity of cats and pretended humming was beneath it while humming softly in its throat. A wind came, large-boned, elemental. It flowed down the long north alley and took a whim at the corner, slapping a few doors smartly enough to startle the timid. Threads knotted at each bell held some doors in their chosen finger-widths. Others swung wide and then returned gently as if remembering their manners. One door banged hard, and a child cried out. The humming did not stop. It bent, thinner for a breath, then deepened as if the notes themselves put on cloaks to keep warm. In that dip and swell, something broke and did not wound. The haberdasher's years-old habit of counting anxieties instead of breaths cracked like dry bread and tasted good. He laughed once, just once, at the silliness of imagining 100 small evils crowding his wife's curtain, then hummed louder because shame had slipped its leash and gone wandering along the tannery lane where the air usually taught the nostrils to be brave. The journeyman who had argued stood with hands that had known both roughness and plenty. He hummed, discovered that humming did not make him foolish, and placed on his threshold a little bar of rough soap as if to tell thieves and neighbors alike, "This is a house that intends to be clean." A footbeat sounded that did not belong on the hour. The quick 3 of a runner. Jan lifted his lantern. A boy came into light, chest heaving, face honest with urgency. It was the mason's son. He held nothing. He had come with a message that stubborned its way through his gasps. He slept, he managed, then swallowed air, then found the rest. With the stones under his hands, he woke, and he was not a wall. He was my father. He told me to run and tell the watchman. The boy looked around at all the doors, all the humming, and in that broader breath the message grew from one house to a street. He is not the only one, he added softly, almost shy. The men came from the southern road. They say the dark is different here. Jane touched the boy's shoulder, a watchman's benediction. Then we will keep making different, he said. He was a man who preferred useful verbs. The wind let up. The humming kept its promise without becoming performance. For some, it lasted no more than a dozen heartbeats. For others, longer, until their knees told them they were no longer 20 and sleep, like a polite guest, touched their shoulders and suggested beds. Doors narrowed to their chosen kindness. Threads held. Bowls caught small reflections of stars. An honest storm gathered itself toward morning. Low grumble, a few fat drops, and then the even spill. The rain walked the roofs like a patient teacher. Matilde set a bowl beneath the moonflower and watched the petals drink. Rain has its own song. It agreed with the night's other music. She stood in her doorway until the shawl of wet air soaked the rim of her sleeve and then stepped back inside like a cat. Zhang's lantern thinned to a coin and then went dark as he reached his own door. He would sleep while the city laced its boots, before Matilde closed her own door to the ordinary comfort of a latch. Someone paused where the step gave a little underway. The scribe, wet and smiling, held up his copy. We hummed until the oldest brother's snore took the fourth note, he reported. We will write it in the margin of the night. Here kindness occurred. Write it everywhere it can be read, she said. Even in places where boasting is frowned upon. He left a thin book blank, good paper on her counter, wrapped in oiled cloth. For your ledger of sleep, he said. Pages enough for a season. She stood with the gift, the storm, the little city made larger by a ritual that asked nothing and returned something. She wound a new thread, the linen she had bartered for, and tied 7 neat knots at precise intervals. Then laid it in the bowl with the linden blossoms. She wrote, the Linden walk. 3 notes, doors kind, fear given the corner of a blanket. A city practiced not being proud. It felt like breathing when she banked the lamp, thunder-stitched the far edge of the sky. The cat turned 3 times and chose the place where knees make a hill in blankets. The page slept between its slivers of wood. Ink, when it rests long enough, becomes a kind of bone. Matilde lay down, left her small door tender, placed her hands on her ribs, and decided not to dislike their movement. In the rain's agreeable racket, she felt her father's winter loosen its last knot, and the room, finding this, loosened with her. Sleep came like a friend who does not knock, because at last it knows the house. Chapter 5. The night the page learned to walk. The morning after the Linden walk wore a look the city had not tried on in years. Rested, not jubilant, not dazed, simply the face of a place that had slept, and therefore did not have to pretend. Cloth dried more willingly on lines. Hooves rang on cobble with patience. When the bell called prime, its sound did not land on nerves like a sudden hand. It landed like a spoon beside a bowl. Matilde, sweeping her little threshold with the small broom that always felt to her like a pen for the floor, found that the dust gathered itself neatly and the cat did not object to being stepped around. On her sill lay 3 more tokens, a ribbon cut from a child's hem, a flat stone warm already with sunlight, and a scrap on which someone had copied the 3 notes with the shaky courage of learning adults. She tucked the ribbon into the dish of harmless, meaningful things, set the stone on top as a paperweight for upcoming breezes. and hummed the notes, not because the shop needed them in daylight, but because the heart sometimes enjoys a practice that asks nothing but presence. The scribe arrived at Tierce with a basket of folded sheets and a little shy triumph in the angle of his shoulders. "We wrote the courtesy into the afternoon psalms," he confessed. "Not to be sung in chapel, perhaps, but to be copied as marginalia so the text will go walking with other texts. We have stitched it behind stories of kings so that the kings will overhear." Matilde laughed softly. "Let them overhear," she said. "Marginalia are often how sense survives pride." She set the sheets where hands could find them while buying mint. "You slept." "I slept," he answered, then leaned closer, conspiratorially humble. "And I dreamed I was copying by moonlight and did not fear leaving the ink uncapped while I slept. I woke to find the ink had not dried to stubbornness. Even the ink had practiced courtesy." They were still speaking when Zhang passed the door. No lantern now, just a walking stick and a pocketful of new greetings. He paused for a loaf of yesterday's bread, hard and excellent for a watchman's teeth, thanked the room with his open hand, and went on, listening as he walked, to the sound of doors that did not clench, to the low laughter of a journeyman telling a neighbor he had slept through a storm that had never come, to the steps of children who were unafraid to tread near thresholds, because thresholds had been kind to them the night before. By midday the first argument arrived, on schedule as arguments do, carried in the mouth of a man who looked tidy even in worry. He wore the guard's badge on his left breast. His leather was well oiled, his ring plain, his belt honest with tools and not too many of them. He came in, removed his cap, and stood in that awkward posture of men asked by duty to move a weight they do not know the shape of. "Matilde," he said, having been corrected once, and corrected his memory to match. "There is talk in the council of mandating shutters closed after vespers. Thieves, they say, love a finger's width. They asked me to inquire whether your custom, courtesy," she supplied. "Courtesy can be practiced without a door." "It can," Matilde said calmly, "because fear is often soothed by solutions that are not arguments." She drew the little sheet nearer and tapped the lines with her finger. "For some homes, a thread and 3 notes are plenty. For others, a bowl of water on the sill. For some doors open, a finger, yes. But a courtesy is a garment that fits many shapes. It is not a uniform. Tell your counsel what you already know. Law cannot make sleep. It can only clear a space where sleep is not frightened." The guard breathed with the relief that comes when a word matches the hole in a thought. "Uniform," he repeated. "They love uniforms. I will tell them the courtesy is not one." He hesitated, then admitted the thing that had been moving nervously in his sleeves. "At matins I woke and did not reach for my pole. I reached for my ribs. I sang like a fool and slept like a child. If they ask me whether doors invite thieves, I will say that sleep invites fewer of them." "Say more," Matilde suggested gently. "Say that a tense city gives thieves sharp edges to hold. A rested one gives them fewer places to catch." She handed him a sprig of rosemary. "Hang this near your desk, for clear counsel, for the scent of kitchens near laws." He left as men leave when carrying 2 tasks, the official one and the interior one. The first was to speak in council. The second was to tend a habit before it grew shy and slunk away. Afternoon softened toward vespers. The cat slept in the exact center of the patch of sun, demonstrating geometry. The moonflower rehearsed a little, edges unfurling and refueling like a yawn disguised as a stretch. The midwife dropped by with the salt-shouldered weariness of someone who had negotiated a difficult birth, with patience rather than force. and Matilde put a cup in her hand before she asked. "She and the child are well," the midwife reported, eyes bright under the tired. "The father cried with his boots still on. I told him to cry seated. He obeyed. The city is learning to obey tenderness," Matilde said. "I did not know how much I wanted that until it began. But you did," the midwife said, with a little grin that was as fond as it was wry. "You brewed for it, and tied threads for it, and hummed until it had a name. In the cool blue hour after vespers, the page drew trouble to itself as fire draws moths." Matilde felt it before she saw it. The way the air near the back room tightened as if a thought had clenched its jaw. She set down the spoon she was washing, dried her hands, and went to the door marked with the unboastful X. A figure stood there, exactly as the scribe had stood the night he came, but harder at the edges, as if worry had taken a blade to the person and pared away softness. Not cloaked, this was no official nor a man who wished to hide. Rather a craftsman, maybe a beadle, maybe a clerk of some smaller law. His face held that earnest anxiety that believes harm will come unless it is the first to touch the thing. In his hand lay an order with a seal. He held it out, not with triumph, but with the righteousness of those trying to do the best version of a bad task. "By council decree," he said, swallowing. "Any text that changes the city's ways must be reviewed by men appointed for that work." The page, Matilde nodded as one nods to weather. She did not argue with the man. He was only a door, not the wind behind it. "I will not hand the page into a room that understands only how to own," she said, voice low and even. "But I will give you something better than a seizure. I will give you a reading." She turned, took the copy, not the old page of honeyed ink, but the words written plain by her own hand, and set it on the counter between them. "Read it aloud to me," she asked, as if he were a child in a chair and she the school. He hesitated. He was not a fool. He heard the invitation. He recognized the refusal behind it. He tried to be dutiful, and found that duty sometimes prefers to be fed. "A city's courtesy at nightfall," he began, and as he read the simple lines his voice changed. It lost the tin of officialdom and took on the timbre of a man talking to a neighbor on a step, practical, embarrassed by tenderness, relieved by clarity. He finished and stood with the sheet in his hands as if it had grown warmer while he held it. "Does it harm?" Matilde asked. "It invites," he said, surprised by his own truth. "Then take it," she said. "Place it before your appointed men. Let them argue it into wisdom. But do not take the page that smells like my father's winter and the linden's first breath in spring. Leave that where it belongs, in a house where it is used more than quoted." His face worked through three expressions: defense, pride, and the relief of not being required to be either. At last he nodded. "I will take the copy," he said, and lowered his voice. "And I will take the hum with me." He folded the sheet and slid it into his sleeve as carefully as a baker carries proofed dough to the oven. "Forgive me for arriving as men with seals arrive. I keep a broom for such arrivals," she said kindly. "You see the dust collects, and I like sweeping." He left by the front door, not the back, and his step down the little stair did not thump with victory or defeat. It landed like a foot that had just learned how to share its weight with the ground. Twilight gathered. The watchman walked. He had added, with the city's blessing and his own, a second sentence to the hour. "If you wake," he called softly after naming the time, "leave a corner of the blanket for fear." Children giggled behind shutters. Old men nodded, feeling something in their ribs loosen. The phrase travelled, turned itself in different mouths, lost nothing essential, and picked up kitchen spices from each house it visited. Matilde banked the lamp. Shadows arranged themselves with courtesy. She sat in the chair by the little back window and let the garden come forward. The pale bells of the moonflower, the small brave digit of a mint leaf pushing its new green toward the night, the linden beyond the wall holding its soft choir of moths. She placed the old page between the slivers of wood and, without looking down, spoke to it as one speaks to an old friend just before sleep. "You're working," she said. "You're walking outside of me." That was always the point. She remembered her father, the winter of the snow that took the world and made it beautiful until the beauty turned to ache. She remembered the day she found the page a slice torn, innocently or deliberately, from a book about psalms and potions, and how the two are more neighbors than enemies. He had left it in a place where her eyes would go when her hands were too tired to lift another jar. She had learned it, not by heart the way schoolboys are commanded to, but by breath, the way lullabies are learned. The way a body surrenders to rocking because rocking is a memory older than thought. Across the years she sent him, now and again, a pot of balm when the ovens burned his arms, and a bag of fennel when the feast days made his belly boastful. His niece brought her loaves on feast mornings. He wrote thanks on scraps that smelled of flour and heat. Both lives had room for the other. Both had chosen their rooms with honesty. The bell counted the slow double heartbeats of the middle night. The city breathed, then the thing that had not happened since winter, a silence in the bells. The hour came, and no note fell. In the tower, a rope had slipped. A pulley, old as the last time someone wrote a century in the square book, had stuck. Silences arrive like messengers who have lost their way. They do not announce themselves as events. They simply fail to bring the usual news. The watchman looked up. His hand went automatically to the bell at his hip, as if it could speak for the tower. He lifted his voice and found that it carried farther than metal when metal had forgotten its duty. The hour he called, firm and kind, and the courtesy answered. From window to window, from door to door, the three notes went out like crumbs for birds. Bowls of water caught the faint sky and made small moons where no moon showed. Threads were counted. Fear, who had come out curious to see what a tower without a voice might do to a city, found itself named at thresholds and offered blankets and grew confused in the way strays grow confused when no one hisses. Matilde stood in her doorway, the cat at her heel, and listened to the city hum its own hour. She did not go to the tower. That was not her house to tend. She did not reach for the vials. She reached for a small bell she used to call herself back from thoughts. She rang it once, lightly, and the ring made by a hand that knows its purpose ran along the street like a little river of reassurance. Neighbors caught the idea and rang their little house bells. The city made a new instrument, a choir of tin and brass and clay, calling not alarm but presence. Children laughed, because laughter is what happens when the world behaves in a new way that is not frightening. Old men wept, because weeping is what happens when the world behaves in a new way that makes it easier to belong to. The guard he of the rosemary stood at a corner where two alleys met, and found that he did not have to shout at any shadow. He hummed instead, and a shadow that had been musing about slipping a hand through a latch decided that tonight was not a night for work. It was a night for sleep. Even the geese near the fountain muttered a kind of assent, their voices busy but not quarrelsome, stormless and strange. The hour passed. The tower remembered itself. In the second half of the night, the bells returned, a little shamefaced, like a singer who missed an entrance and re-enters humming to catch up. No one berated the tower. Towers do not respond to scolding. They respond to hands and oil and quiet patience. In the morning, a cooper and a smith, and the scribe whose nimble fingers could coax both ink and cords went up together and eased the pulley and set a new knot in the rope. The council met with their accustomed dignity. On their table lay the copy of the courtesy, wrinkled a little where it had been read more than once by hands not practiced in careful folding. They had prepared arguments. The arguments wilted in the presence of a city that had not panicked when the bells fell silent. The guard spoke about rosemary and law and kitchens. The scribe spoke about marginal notes and sleep. Jan, who had been asked for his report in the tone of men who expect other men to flatter them, spoke in the tone of one who prefers stones to chairs. "We asked," he said simply, and they answered. A city that answers when asked is safer than a city that obeys when commanded. They made no decree. They made, in that rare grown-up way that makes grown-up life bearable, a record. It read, "The city acknowledges the Linden courtesy and commends it to houses as a neighborly right." That was all. It was enough. The thief, that evening, brought biscuits. "I did not take them," he said, knowing the joke was gentle and would be caught. "I baked them where no one watches, with flour paid for. I have not worked 3 nights. I may not be good at sleeping every night without debt, but I have discovered I am not angry when I try." He set the biscuits on the counter and did not wait for thanks. He stood in the doorway as if guarding something fragile he had not known was his. The mason's boy returned with more news that made the room stretch to hold it. "He dreamed a wall," he said, "but this time he built it between 2 gardens and the gate was unlatched." He woke and said the word gate like it was a friend. Matilde handed him a sprig of mint and did not hide her tears. Boys are improved when shown that tears are not only for sorrow. It rained again, brief and welcoming. The linden trees stood with their pale sails and let the drops weigh them, then lifted and shook like dogs who have decided to forgive weather. Matilde took the old page out and held it up to the lamplight. It did not shine. It absorbed, as old paper does, and gave back a tone like the underside of wheat. She read it without moving her lips. "Take the night as you would take a friend's cloak, not to become him, but to keep your shoulders from the rain." She had thought the secret was the page. It was not. It was the voice the page gave back to the city when the city read it out loud instead of locking it into a cabinet. It was the way the scribe wrote copies that did not own the words but served them. The way the watchman made a sentence into a habit. The way the guard carried rosemary into a room where leather and law could have smelled only of themselves. The way a thief learned that sleep has wrists he could not shackle and did not wish to. The way a father set down the second candle and did not lose his power, only found a better version of it. Still, Matilde kept the page, for keeping sometimes is simply gentleness toward the vessel that carried what needed to be poured. She returned it to its wood slivers and sat with her breath on her ribs, deciding again not to dislike the movement. The cat woke cats wake the way pages turn, quietly and padded to lay its chin on her knee. The lamp made its honey circle. Outside, the watchman called the hour and s, if it had always been there planted under cobbles waiting for this season. His voice added the sentence that belonged to the city now. "Neighbors, leave your small door kinder. Good night." On a night without bells, the city had remembered its voice. On a night with bells, it kept remembering. There would be winters again, with their stubborn blankets. There would be storms, and the council would fuss, and a man somewhere would sell rope and call it sleep. Children would grow and forget and remember. The scribe would die with ink on his fingers, and another scribe would take his stool. The midwife would wash her hands after her last birth, and sit on a bench and hum. Gain would train a younger man to call the hour with a voice that made the hour the cities and not the towers. The thief would fall in love and discover, one astonishing morning, that he had slept through the hour when men like him had once done their best work. And Matilde, she would do what she had always done: put dew in bowls when dew asked to be held, make salves that smelled of bees and summer, tie threads the color of linen and patience, copy the page until knowing it became a small law of her hands. In time, one of those hands would rest on the head of a girl, perhaps the magistrate's daughter, perhaps the mason's boy's sister, perhaps a child no one had guessed at, and the hand would say without words, "This house will be yours to keep open." She banked the lamp. She left the door a finger's kindness. She set her palms where her ribs remembered rocking. She chose a beautiful thing to say to the dark. "Moonflowers opening when no one claps." She said it. The dark, flattered, became a room. Far above, in the tower, the new knot held. Rope creaked like an old man laughing. The bell slept until it would be asked for again. The city did not wait for it to wake. It had learned to hum. Chapter 6. The door we keep for tomorrow. The first cold carried the river's breath farther than usual, curling it along alleys and under shutters, as if the water itself had decided to take the long way home. Linden leaves turned the color of old brass and let go with a patience that sounded like soft applause on the cobbles. People drew their cloaks about their shoulders. Bakers turned their ovens into second suns. Washerwomen warmed their hands on steaming pails and laughed at the geese, who behaved like courtiers scandalized by frost. Matilde felt the season approach in her wrists. Herb jars that had been generous all summer settled into quiet. Mint went from chatter to murmur. The moonflowers in her small back garden rehearsed fewer openings each night, as though they were teaching themselves how to bow. She copied the Linden courtesy in a thicker hand, the sort that tired eyes could read by one candle, and set a little basket of sprigs and threads beneath. The notice so poor hands might help themselves without asking. The page, old honey brown, familiar, rested between its slivers of wood. Sometimes, when she lifted it after a long day's listening, she thought she felt a lightness in it, as if the city had begun to carry its own copy around and the original could lie back and be a page again. That thought never made her careless. She touched the old paper like she touched the cat, as if it would forgive her, and as if forgiveness should not be needed. Gan walked the longer way on colder nights. His lantern described warmer circles when door hinges stiffened. "Neighbors," he called, voice round and unhurried in the thinning air, "leave your small door kinder. If you wake, give fear the corner of a blanket." Sometimes, he added, because winter makes honest men practical, "and check your coals." The sentence travelled well with the others. It sat on thresholds like a sensible cousin at a feast. Not elegant, necessary, the magistrate came seldom. When he did, he stood in the doorway without passing in, as if he had decided that part of courtesy was not taking up room in someone else's house when your own had learned to be kinder. Once he raised his hand, an unbeautiful hand, honest with work now that he no longer hid from the night in too many candles, and said simply, "I hum out loud." Matilde bowed her head. She did not say this is government. She did not need to. The city had learned more in 3 notes than in a sheaf of edicts. The thief came in with winter on his shoulders, looking almost handsome in the way a reformed story looks when the teller skips the part where the hero runs away and instead quietly stays. He placed a little parcel wrapped in rough cloth on the counter. Within lay a set of needles and a thimble made of horn polished to amber. "For mending," he said. "It keeps me out of trouble to fix what other hands have frayed." He shrugged, embarrassed by the size of the gift compared to the size of the life it suggested. A wall at my back, 3 notes in my mouth, a door left friendly. It turns out thieves do not love such houses. They love doors that quarrel with themselves. Matilde agreed. Yours has learned to make peace. She set the thimble near the dish of harmless, meaningful things, the bracelet with the cheap blue stone, the ribbon cut from a hem, a stone warm from someone's pocket where it took on the same small light as the others. Proof that kindness, like salt, enters quietly and improves everything it touches. The scribe grew older as pages grow older, slowly, graciously, with an ink spot or two to mark where time has dipped its pen. He copied the courtesy into margins where kings needed their names. He copied it under a prayer against storms, and found that storms did not take offense. He copied it at the bottom of a page of laws, and a clerk reading it before lighting a taper felt something ease in his jaw. "I thought law was a wall," the scribe confessed, setting his palm flat on Matilde's counter. "But you have made of it a bench. Law is at its best a bench," Matilde said, "and at its worst a ladder leaned against someone else's roof." Winter deepened. The river slowed, learned to carry the skies white with less hurry. On a morning when roofs wore their brief caps, a bellman from the eastern quarter arrived with a notice and a face like a quarrel. He began by clearing his throat, as if that might remove kindness from what he had to say. "A fever," he announced to the room, though the room already knew, because rooms are where news learns to sit. Down by the rope walk, not the childbed kind, not the swamp kind, the kind that runs hot and looks for lungs to loosen. The word fever travels faster than any bell. Matilde felt the old ledger in her bones open at a page her father had marked with care. Willow tea and cool cloths. Rooms aired despite weather. Pride laid down like a heavy pail because pride spreads what humility can help carry. She looked at Jayan, who had come in on the wind without his lantern, because daytime had its own kind of watch. "We will teach the night to be prudent," she said, "and the day to be polite." The next day's braided work with worry. Matilde unstoppered jars and wrote in a hand that kept its own pulse. "Steep willow, do not smother with blankets. Leave a finger's width for the air to learn the room. 3 notes, even when breath is small. A bowl for water at the sill to remind courage it still has lips." The midwife took one street. A washerwoman took another. The scribe carried copies to the rope walk, where men's hands smelled of tar and weather. Jan walked in daylight for a time, his watchman's gait unconcerned with owning the hour, only keeping it from tripping. The guildman set thyme and lemon balm in a bowl at the guild hall, and even the geese kept a respectful half-silence, as if gossip knew when to be tender. Not everyone learned at once. A household at the rope walk shut its shutters like fists and boiled itself into worry. The fever stayed to profit. When Matilde arrived with willow and water and the old page in her pocket, not to reach for, but to carry as one carries a talisman of remembered scents, the woman of the house wept hard once and then opened the window the width of a person's thumb. The fever did not turn on its heel because of a thumb's width. It never does. But it noticed the door and began to consider leaving. Night came. The watchman called the hour and added to his litany with an almost fatherly gravity. "Neighbors, let fresh air be your guest. The phrase did not sing as prettily as the others. It did not need to. Good sentences, like good bread, do their work without praising themselves. On the third night of the fever, the bell rope in the tower seized again, frost in the pulley, swollen wood. The bell forgot the hour. The city did not. The small house bells rang without panic. Humming travelled soft. Doors lifted their latches, then rested them again. Threads counted themselves. A woman in the rope walk, who had mocked the Linden walk in autumn, stood at her threshold and opened a blanket's corner for fear to warm itself, while she cooled her husband's forehead, and sang 3 notes that sounded like questions and became, slowly, answers. Matilde had not slept much. She lay down only when the cat insisted, with the imperiousness of those who care for others by pretending not to. Even then, she left the door kind and placed her hands on her ribs and decided not to dislike the movement, so that her body would remember how to remember for those whose bodies had forgotten. In a dozen that felt like a bench more than a bed, she dreamed that the page walked out of the shop between its 2 slivers of wood, like a man carrying his own cradle, and the letters fell into the street and took root where linden leaves had recently taken their leave. In the dream, people stepped around them without fear. The letters rose like small plants and put out 3-note blossoms. She woke with the dream's calm still in her throat, and found the scribe asleep on her stool with a copy half finished under his cheek. She placed a shawl over his shoulders, the cat over his lap, and her own hand over the page where it lay, to greet it as one greets a friend in a crowded room, lightly, to keep from bruising presence with gratitude. The fever loosened. It left as weather leaves, not because it was convinced, but because it had run out of its own breath. It took with it some of the city's proud habits and left behind, as fevers sometimes do when they are met with courtesy rather than panic, a discipline people can keep. Windows that had been sealed like vaults lost their fear of winter air. Beds learned to love clean corners. The bowl on the sill became not a charm but a good habit. Men who had thought the linden walk a song for summer learned to hum against the cracking of ice. After the fever broke, the council asked carefully, in the new tone they were learning to use, whether the city might mark the night when bells failed, and neighbours answered with a small festival that would not get out of hand. They wanted to name it. Naming is a habit councils have when they recognize they did not invent a thing but wish to make room for it on the calendar. The night of the small bells, the scribe suggested, smiling toward Matilde's bowl of little house bells. The courtesy night, said the guildman, who had grown tired of words that sounded like uniforms. The linden night, Jang aloud, thinking of the way moths made choruses without a conductor. Matilde listened as people who do not need to own things listen. Call it what your mouths can hold, she said, so long as it is not called triumph. She did ask one thing, let it be quiet enough to mend a seam in. They promised. They meant it. When the night came round, the first mild one, after the cold had done its ceremony and gone, people hung a single sprig of linden at the latch. They knotted threads without making a parade of knots. At the 12th bell, John called the hour, and the city answered with the patient humming of those who have learned they are stronger than their fear and softer than their pride. No trumpets, no dancers stamping the cobbles into boasting. Children were permitted to stand with bare feet on thresholds. Old people were helped to benches. The geese took advantage and extracted crumbs from unguarded hands and were forgiven. Matilde did not plan to speak. She preferred work to speeches. But a hush gathered near her door, a hush that looked like a question asking for a cup. She stepped into it. The old page, safe at home, weighed her pocket. The copy on the wall caught lamplight like a little altar bread for kitchens. Neighbours, she said, not loudly, not softly. You have taught the night its manners. Keep teaching, when storms come and they will hum, when ropes freeze and they will ring the little bells. When fear sits where it can hear you breathe, give it a corner and say, you may stay only if you help me listen. Keep the air moving, keep the door kind. Keep one candle less than you think you need, and discover that you already have more. The words were not new. That was their virtue. Hands went to ribs. Ribs lifted. Doors made their small shifts. 3 notes, again and again, the human bees finding flowers they themselves had planted. After, in the honey hour, when people begin to want their beds, to show them a little mercy, the magistrate's daughter, taller now, quicker with her laughter, worldlier in her eyes, without being unkind, came to Matilde with a bundle tied in plain cloth. For you, she said, ironed this time not with ceremony but with affection. A cloak worked with tiny leaves in the color of linden shade. To keep you, she added, and then, because she had learned from the page to finish sentences only when breath said yes, warm, Matilde accepted the weight like a blessing that knew how to sit. She touched the embroidery as one reads a familiar prayer with her fingertips. Will you keep the page one day? She asked, without startling herself. People sometimes discover, at odd hours, that a question has been waiting years to become a mouthful of air. The girl did not blush with pride or frown with false modesty. She put her hand over the pocket where the old paper lay and matched Matilde's quiet. I will keep it by not needing to keep it, she said. I will keep it by humming where laws are written and where bread is cut. And when a boy runs to tell a watchman good news, I will make sure he finds a door open in every street. Then it will be yours, Matilde said. And already is, a little. The scribe, standing where lamplight showed the new web of veins on his hands like fine writing, coughed a polite cough to cover the part of him that did not want to weep. He had brought her something wrapped in oiled paper, the blank book he'd given long ago, now filled with her pale ink, and a second one, empty, ready. On the inside cover, in his exacting hand, he had copied the oldest lines. Take the night as you would take a friend's cloak, not to become him, but to keep your shoulders from the rain. He did not sign his name. He wrote only, at the bottom, for the ledger of sleep, which is the ledger of mercy. Jane came last, because it was the watchman's way to finish his orbit before stepping into any house, even as loved as this one. He set his lantern on the counter, unlit, as a trophy of a kind that does not boast. We did not need you this hour. We might need you the next rest, little son. There will be a younger watchman, he said, sooner than the city thinks. I will teach him the sentence before I teach him the streets. Teach him to listen before he speaks, Matilde replied. And Zhang's shoulders confessed that this had been the real lesson all along. Night thinned. People carried their humming inside and laid it at the foot of their beds, as one lays down a cloak before sleeping. Doors paused at their kindness, and then eased into their latches, like friends who know how to leave without hurting anything. The river breathed. The linden trees performed their soft trick of making moths feel like stars had come near. In the tower, the bell remembered. In the houses, the little bells remembered. In the ribs, breath remembered. Matilde banked the lamp so its circle was a whisper. She drew out the page and read it, not with eyes now, but with hands that remembered every copy she had taught them to make. She thought of her father, of the winter that had been beautiful until beauty hurt, of the first time she left a door a finger's width and discovered that thresholds can be teachers, not just guards. She thought of the boy with the stones, now taller, now making his own wall between gardens with a gate that loved to be left unlatched. She thought of the thief knitting a sleeve by the linden fence and swearing softly when his needle found an old scar. She thought of the guildman with lemon balm at his ledger, of the midwife bathing a child while humming toward the east for the cannon's sake, of the guard with rosemary in the room where voices met without trying to win. She wrapped the page, set it between the slivers of wood, and slid it into its place. She left it with a message not written but perfectly clear. You can walk now when you like. You know the way back. She put on the new cloak, not for warmth, though that was welcome, but so that when she lay down and sleep came as a friend, it would find her dressed in the city's fabric. She left the small door kinder. She placed her hands upon her ribs and decided, as always, not to dislike the movement. Then she chose the beautiful thing she would say to the dark, and it was this: a city that hums when bells forget. She smiled into the room. The cat found its hill in the blanket and sank with the gravity of kings. The lamp made honey out of a bit of oil and good wick. Beyond the door, feet softened. Voices dwindled. Jan called the last hour like a man tying a bow on a parcel meant for morning. Sleep crossed the threshold with the courtesy it had been taught, and took its place without troubling the page, or the bell, or the breath. In the quiet, the city kept what it had learned, that doors can be teachers, that fear, when given a corner of a blanket, often chooses the floor by morning, that a bowl of water on a sill makes a mirror so small and honest that even the night recognizes itself and behaves. And so, dear listener, as our tale softens to its close, let your own room practice what theirs practiced. Leave a door, a finger's kindness, hum 3 notes, no hurry. Tie a thread and touch your ribs, and call one beautiful memory by name. Let the page of your night be walked by the gentlest footsteps. Let the bells, if they forget you, be forgiven. Breathe once more, the way a linden releases a leaf without sorrow, without pride. Lay your head where the pillow keeps the cool side ready. If fear comes, offer it the corner and tell it stories about moonflowers opening when no one claps. Listen for Jayang's voice in the distance, or for the cat's soft kingly weight settling into sleep. Know that Matilde's lamp has been banked, the page is safe, and the city hums even now, and so the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night.